A mountain man saved an Apache beauty, dragging her out of a frozen ravine and giving her shelter in his lonely cabin. But the next day, the ground shook with hoofbeats. 200 warriors surrounded his home, believing he had stolen her. The man had no family left, just his rifle, his Bible, and a wounded stranger whose uncle was a powerful chief. He thought saving her life was enough. He thought mercy would bring peace. But in the high country, nothing is simple. A corrupt traitor is claiming her as his bride. Soldiers are ready to call him a renegade, and one wrong word could ignite war. Now, he must stand between two worlds facing betrayal, false promises, and the pull of his own broken faith. When mercy sparks suspicion, when justice demands sacrifice, will one mountain man's courage be enough to stop blood from spilling on the snow? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story, too. The winter wind howled across the Colorado highlands like a hungry wolf, whipping snow into ghostly shapes as dusk settled over the rugged landscape. Louis Boone pulled his wool collar higher, his weathered eyes tracking the distinctive marks of ravens in the fresh powder. The blackbirds often led him to fallen deer or elk, but something about their pattern today spoke of different prey. His boots crunched through the crusty top layer as he followed the meandering trail. The ravens had been circling, landing, moving on, their tracks telling a story of interest in something hidden from view. The setting sun painted the snow-laden pines in amber and purple, marking the edge of safe traveling hours in these treacherous mountains. Louise paused at the lip of a snow-choked ravine, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. There, half buried in a drift, lay a human form. His heart quickened as he carefully picked his way down the steep slope. Years of mountain experience guiding each step. It was a woman, dressed in Apache clothing, partially covered by snow. Her face was flushed with fever, despite the cold, and a torn sleeve revealed a bullet graze on her arm, crusted with frozen blood. Louise quickly checked her pulse, weak but steady. She was alive, but wouldn't be for long in these conditions. Scanning the area with practiced eyes, he found what he was looking for: tracks. The distinctive prints of a heavily laden mule led south, along with boot marks that spoke of a trader's gait. The trail was already growing faint as new snow filled in the depressions. Louise knew he could follow it, track down whoever had left this woman to die, but one look at her fever-bright face told him there wasn't time. Justice would have to wait. Survival came first. Working quickly, Louis gathered straight willow branches from beneath the snow. Using his hunting knife, he stripped them down and lashed them together with leather straps from his pack. His thick wool bedroll would serve as the bed of the travois. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. "Hang on," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. With gentle efficiency, he shifted her onto the makeshift sled, wrapping her in his spare blanket. The woman didn't stir, a bad sign in this cold. The climb out of the ravine was brutal work. Louis leaned into the harness he'd fashioned, his boots searching for purchase on the slick slope. Snow had begun falling again, the flakes catching in his graying beard as he hauled his burden upward. The spindrift, fine snow blown from the ridges, stung his face like tiny needles. His line shack stood a mile away, a humble shelter he'd built 5 years ago when he'd first claimed this territory as his trapping ground. Louise had fled west after Sarah died, seeking solitude in these high places where the air was thin and memories couldn't follow. Now, for the first time in years, he was bringing another soul into his sanctuary. Darkness had fully settled by the time the cabin's outline emerged from the swirling snow. Louis's arms trembled from the effort of pulling the travois, but he didn't slow until they reached the door. The iron handle was so cold, it nearly stuck to his bare hand as he pushed inside. The cabin was simple. One room with a potbelly stove, a narrow bed, some shelves stocked with basic supplies, and a table that doubled as his workbench for cleaning furs. It wasn't much, but right now it was shelter from the killing cold. And that made it a palace. Louis wasted no time getting a fire going in the stove, feeding it precious dry wood he kept stacked inside. As warmth began to seep into the space, he gently transferred the woman to his bed. Her clothes were damp from the snow. They'd have to be dried, but that would wait. First, the wound needed tending. He set a pot of snow to melt on the stove while he gathered his medical supplies, clean rags, needle and thread, and a bottle of whiskey he kept for just such purposes. The golden lamplight threw dancing shadows on the log walls as he worked, cleaning the bullet graze with careful dedication. The wound wasn't deep, but infection was setting in. He poured whiskey over it, murmuring a quiet prayer as he worked. Lord, if you're still listening to an old fool like me, help her pull through. The woman stirred then, her eyes fluttering open. They were dark and intelligent, filled with equal parts fear and defiance despite her weakness. Her lips moved, forming words in a mixture of Spanish and broken English. You, who are you? What you want? Her hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping his wrist. Luis remained still, letting her hold on while meeting her gaze steadily. Name's Louise. Boone, he said softly. Found you in the snow. You're safe here. She studied his face intently, searching for truth or lies. Why you help? Louise shrugged slightly. Seemed the right thing to do. Are you hungry? I've got some broth warming. She didn't answer immediately, still watching him with wary eyes. Luis moved slowly, telegraphing his movements as he reached for his rifle. Her body tensed, but instead of pointing it at her, he set it within her reach. There, he said. You can shoot me if I try anything foolish, but right now, you need to eat and rest. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the first hint of trust. She released his wrist, but kept her hand near the rifle. I am Nadali, she said finally. Louise nodded in acknowledgement and went to check the broth. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their yips and howls carrying clearly through the thin mountain air. The wind picked up again, finding every gap in the cabin's chinked logs and making the lamplight flutter. He helped Nadali sit up enough to sip the warm broth, supporting her head with one calloused hand. Her fever was still high, but she managed to drink most of what he offered before exhaustion pulled her back into unconsciousness. Louise moved efficiently around the small space, banking the fire with fresh logs to last the night. He shot the bar across the door, more from habit than any real concern about intruders. Few people ventured this high in winter, and those who did usually had the sense to announce themselves. Setting a bucket of snow near the stove to melt, Louis settled into his chair. He dozed plenty of nights here, watching over his trap lines or waiting out storms. Now he watched over something far more precious, a life entrusted to his care, whether by chance or providence. Every hour or so, he rose to check on Nadali, replacing the damp cloth on her forehead when it grew warm. Her breathing had steadied, though the fever still burned in her cheeks. Sometimes she muttered in Apache, words he couldn't understand but recognized as prayers from their cadence. The night deepened. Wind-driven snow hissed against the window, and the fire popped and crackled in the stove. Luis pulled out his worn journal, a habit he'd started after Sarah died, and began to write by lamplight. The scratching of his pencil joined the cabin's quiet symphony of sounds. Found a woman today, he wrote. Apache. Someone shot her and left her to die in the snow. I keep thinking about tracking them down, but she needed help more than I need revenge. Besides, revenge belongs to God, if he's still keeping count up here in the high country. He paused, watching Nadali stir restlessly in her sleep. The rifle lay untouched where he placed it, a gesture of trust that had meant more than words could have. Trust was rare out here, especially between whites and Indians. But maybe that's what made it valuable. Louise dipped the cloth in cool water again, gently bathing Nadali's forehead. Her fever seemed a bit lower now, her sleep more natural. Outside, the coyotes had gone quiet, and the wind was dying down. Dawn was still hours away, but already this night had changed something. He'd spent 5 years building walls around his. Solitude, and now a wounded stranger had brought them down with a single grasp of his wrist. He returned to his chair, keeping watch as the lamp burned low. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for tonight his duty was clear. Tend the fire, cool the fever, and guard the sleep of one who'd been wronged but not abandoned. Simple tasks, but holy in their way, like his mother's old prayers over bread dough or his father's careful blessing of newly planted fields. The night crept on, marked by the steady tick of his pocket watch and the soft breathing of his unexpected guest. Luis dozed between his hourly checks, but never deeply. He was used to light sleep, a necessary skill for a mountain man. Every time he woke, his first glance was toward the bed, making sure Nadali was still resting quietly. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she spoke again, her voice clearer than before. Water? Luis brought her a tin cup, helping her drink. Fever's breaking, he said, noting her cooler skin and more focused gaze. Why you not chase them? She asked. The man who shot. Luis considered the question carefully. You needed help more than they needed catching, he said finally. Sometimes mercy matters more than justice. Nadali's eyes held his for a long moment before she nodded slightly. Gracias, she whispered, drifting back to sleep. Luis returned to his vigil, adding another log to the stove. The night was deep and cold outside, but here in this small space, something warm and vital had taken root. Not hope, exactly. He'd learned to be careful with that word, but perhaps the beginning of healing. For both the wounded and the watcher. Near midnight, the wind rose to a howl, driving snow through every crack in the cabin's chinked walls. Luis moved methodically in the lamp's glow, feeding chunks of pine into the pot-belly stove. The fire's warmth barely reached the corners of the small space, but he kept it steady, knowing Nadali's life might depend on it. He gathered his healing supplies from a worn leather satchel, a tin of pine pitch, rendered bear grease and clean, cloth strips. The mixture was something he'd learned years ago from an old Ute medicine woman, sticky and pungent, but effective against infection. As he worked the ingredients together with practiced hands, he kept one ear tuned to Nadali's labored breathing. The bullet graze looked angry in the flickering light. Luis cleaned it again with warm water, then carefully spread the poultice over the wound. Nadali stirred at his touch but didn't wake. Her sleeve was torn where the bullet had passed through, and Luis could see how it might catch on the bandage. He threaded a needle by lamplight, his big hands surprisingly nimble. As he stitched the rough fabric closed. No Volver. Nadali's voice was thick with fever. Her head moved restlessly on the pillow. Silvertooth, he says papers. Luis leaned closer, trying to make sense of her fevered words. She switched between Spanish and English, but one detail stood out clearly. A trader with a silver tooth who'd boasted about selling her back where papers say. The description sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the storm. Don Mateo Salazar. Luis had crossed paths with the Mexican trader before, had seen how he used debt and drink to trap both settlers and Indians in impossible bargains. The man's silver tooth flashed when he smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. Salazar was known for running credit schemes that left families owing more than they could ever repay. Luis had heard whispers of how he used those debts to force people, especially young women, into situations they'd never choose freely. The thought of Nali in his grip made Luis's jaw clench. The blizzard raged on, but sometime near dawn, the fury began to ease. Luis needed to empty the ash pan before it overflowed, so he wrapped his coat tight and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The ravine where he'd found Nadali was completely drifted over now, smooth white hiding the desperate scene below Dot. As he emptied the ashes into the snow, something caught his eye, a tiny spark of light. Far to the south, probably in the valley where Salazar kept his trading post. Luis studied it for a long moment before the cold drove him back inside. That spark meant someone was awake down there, perhaps planning their next move. Back in the warmth of the cabin, Luis pulled out his pocket journal. The small book was well worn, its pages filled with 5 years of weather notes, supply lists, and private thoughts. He wrote carefully by lamplight. January 15, 1879. Heavy snow from northwest. Temp well below freezing. Found woman in ravine. Bullet wound to arm. Fever high but stable. Applied pine pitch poultice at midnight. Suspect Don Mateo involved. Saw light at trading post. He set the journal aside and began brewing willow bark tea, another remedy learned from years in the mountains. The bitter smell filled the cabin as it steeped. When it was ready, he helped Nadali sit up enough to sip it. She seemed more aware now, her eyes focusing on his face as she drank. "This will help with the fever," he explained softly. "Try to rest." She managed a few more sips before exhaustion pulled her under again, but her breathing seemed easier now. The tea would help bring the fever down, given time. Luis settled her back against the pillow and checked her forehead. Still hot, but not the burning heat of before dawn was creeping in, gray light seeping through the frozen window pane. Luis knew he needed sleep, but first he had to secure the cabin. He'd been alone so long, he'd gotten careless about security. Now, with Natalie under his protection and Salazar possibly searching, he couldn't take chances. He strung a line of tin cups near the door, an old trapper's trick that would rattle if anyone tried to enter. His Colt revolver, a single action model he'd carried for years, went on the table within easy reach of his chair. Only then did he allow himself to sink into the worn leather seat, his body finally registering how tired he was. The morning deepened around them. Outside, the snow squeaked with that particular sound it only makes in deep cold, when each crystal grinds against its neighbors. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine white world and temperatures that could freeze a man solid in hours. Luis dozed lightly, waking at every sound. The pop of a log in the stove, the slight shift of Nadali's breathing, the wind finding new ways through the walls. Each time he opened his eyes, his first glance was toward the bed, checking on his patient. Each time, he found her sleeping peacefully, the worst of the fever seeming to pass. The tin cups hung silent by the door. No alarm raised in the quiet morning. But Luis knew better than to relax his guard. Salazar wasn't known for giving up easily. On something, or someone, he considered his property. That light in the valley meant trouble might already be heading their way. For now, though, the cabin was warm and secure. Nadali was healing, her color better than it had been last night. The morning sun began to strike rainbow sparks through the frost on the window pane, and Luis allowed himself a moment of quiet gratitude. Whatever came next, they'd survived the night. He checked his watch. 7 o'clock. Time enough for a short rest before he needed to tend the fire again. The chair wasn't comfortable, but he'd slept in worse places. As his eyes grew heavy, Luis kept one hand near the Colt. In the bed, Nadali murmured something soft in Apache, a peaceful sound this time rather than the desperate words of fever. The snow continued to creak outside, the cold setting in deep as morning fully arrived. But inside the cabin, warmth held steady, and two people who'd been strangers yesterday found refuge in sleep, while tin cups stood guard and the stove kept its quiet vigil against the winter chill. The late morning sun streamed through the cabin's frosted window, turning the new snow outside into a dazzling blanket of diamonds. Inside, the potbelly stove radiated steady warmth as Nadali stirred from her healing sleep. Louise watched carefully as she pushed herself to sit up, her movements slow but purposeful. "Water?" he offered, already reaching for the tin cup. She nodded, then spoke in careful English. "Thank you for everything." Her voice was stronger than it had been during the fever. Though still carrying the weight of exhaustion, Louise brought her the water, then pulled his chair closer to the stove where she now sat wrapped in a wool blanket. He waited patiently as she gathered her thoughts, recognizing the struggle of someone trying to speak difficult truths. "I am niece to Chief Nanton," she began, her fingers tightening around the cup. "My people, 200 souls, we winter north of here, in the sheltered valley." She paused, taking a sip of water before continuing. "The trader, Don Mateo, he made arrangement with reservation sub-agent. Said I was promised him." Then, Lucy's jaw tightened, but he kept his silence, letting her tell the story at her own pace. "No priest," she said, her voice bitter. "Just marks in his ledger book, made while sub-agent drank whiskey." She looked up at Louise, her dark eyes full of determination. "I could not stay, would not." Louise nodded slowly, understanding filling the spaces between her words. He'd seen such arrangements before. Corruption wrapped in paper-thin legality, sealed with alcohol and greed. He rose and moved to the small shelf where he kept his meager supplies. "Would you like some cornbread?" he offered, pulling down a cloth-wrapped loaf and a small jar of honey. "It's a day old, but the honey helps." Nadali accepted a piece, spreading a thin layer of honey across it with careful movements. The simple act of sharing food seemed to ease something in the air between them. "I should tell you my truth as well," Louis said, settling back in his chair. He stared into the stove's open door, watching the flames dance. "I was a homesteader once, in Missouri. Had a wife, Sarah." His voice grew soft with old grief. "She died in childbirth, took our baby with her. After that, I couldn't bear the silence of our cabin. Came to the high country to find a different kind of quiet." Nadali listened with the same respect he'd shown her, offering no empty words of comfort. Instead, she broke her cornbread in half and held out a portion to him. The gesture spoke louder than any words could have done as they ate in companionable silence. Louise noticed how Nadali's eyes kept moving to the barred door. He understood. Being trapped was what she'd fled from, even if this cabin was safer than what lay outside. "The door," he said, standing. "We can leave it unbarred while we're both inside. You have my word. I'll never lock you in." Relief flickered across her face as he removed the heavy wooden bar. "Thank you," she said softly. Then, with a hint of steel in her voice, "I would rather die in the snow than be caged again." Louise nodded, respecting both her courage and her warning. "I need to check my cache and trapline soon," he said. "We'll need more supplies if this weather holds." "You will go outside?" There was a note of tension in her question. "Yes, but not far," he assured her. "The cache is maybe 20 minutes on snowshoes, and I set snares nearby. I'll be gone no more than an hour. You'll be able to see me through the window most of the time." She considered this, then nodded. "You will say before you go? Each time?" "Each time," he promised. "And I'll always tell you when I'll return." Around midday, Louis strapped on his snowshoes and set out as promised. The sun had warmed the air slightly, but the snow still creaked under his feet as he made his way to the supply cache. He found the rabbit in one of his snares, a welcome addition. to their supplies. At the cache, he gathered jerky and beans, carefully rewrapping everything to protect it from moisture. True to his word, he returned within the hour. Nadali had moved to the window while he was gone, and he made sure she could see him clearly as he approached. His arms full of supplies. The afternoon passed quietly as they settled into a careful routine. Luis tended the fire and prepared a simple meal while Nadali rested, her strength returning steadily. Her color improved as the hours passed, the fever fully broken now. Late in the afternoon, she sat up straighter and reached for her long black hair, which had come loose during her illness. With practiced movements, she began to braid it, her fingers working swiftly despite her injured arm. When she finished, she looked more like herself, a proud Apache woman, not a fevered refugee. "Thank you," she said again, but this time in Apache, the words carrying a deeper resonance. Then she taught him something, a phrase in her language that made his heart catch with its meaning. "She-e-do," she said carefully, watching to see if he understood. "What does it mean?" "Hey," asked, trying to wrap his tongue around the unfamiliar sounds. "You and I together," she translated. "Not like ownership," she added quickly, her expression fierce. "Like purpose. Two people walking same path." Luis repeated the phrase slowly, "she-e-do," and saw her nod in approval. The words felt right in his mouth, like a truth he hadn't known he was waiting to speak. As evening approached, Luis stepped outside to check the sky for signs of weather. The sun was setting in a clear horizon, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. No clouds threatened new storms, but in the mountains, weather could change as quick as a rattler's strike. From inside, he heard Nadali moving about, her footsteps growing steadier. She had insisted on helping with small tasks throughout the Tizavotov day, and Luis had learned to recognize when offering help would be an insult to her strength. The trust they built felt as delicate and precious as the frost crystals glittering on the trees. Not just the trust between a man and woman, but between two people from different worlds who had both known loss and the bite of others' greed. It was trust born of respect, shown in unbarred doors, and promises kept, in stories shared over cornbread. And Honey. Luis stood in the doorway, watching the last light fade from the sky. Behind him, the cabin glowed with warmth and lamplight, no longer just his solitary shelter, but a place where two wounded souls had found unexpected sanctuary. He knew there would be challenges ahead. Don Mateo would not give up easily, and Chief Nanton would surely be searching for his niece. But for now, in this quiet evening moment, there was peace in the simple truth of she-e-do, you and I together. He took one last look at the darkening sky before stepping back inside, careful to leave the door unbarred behind him. The evening settled around them like a gentle blanket as they prepared for whatever the next day might bring. Dawn crept over the Colorado highlands, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pearl and rose. Inside the line shack, Luis stirred from his chair, where he'd kept his customary watch through the night. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to filter through the frost-etched windows when he felt it a deep vibration running through the cabin's rough-hewn timbers. Hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats. Lois exchanged a quick glance with Nadali, who had already risen from her pallet by the stove, her face tense but composed. She gave him a slight nod, acknowledging what they both knew was coming. Moving with deliberate calm, Luis lifted his rifle and eased the cabin door open. The sight that greeted him made his breath catch in his throat. Against the brightening sky, a line of mounted warriors crested the snow-covered ridge. Their shields, painted with symbols of power and protection, caught the early morning light. Rawhide quivers hung at their sides, filled with arrows fletched for war. What struck Luis most was their discipline, not a single voice broke the crystalline silence of the winter morning. From among the warriors, one figure moved forward. Even without Nadali's descriptions, Lise would have known this was Chief Nanton. The Apache leader sat his horse like a man carved from the mountains themselves, his face as stern as weathered stone, his eyes dark and sharp as obsidian, fixed on Louise with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey. Every line of his bearing spoke of a man who believed his niece had been stolen. A way Louise knew this moment could end in blood or peace. With slow, deliberate movements, he lowered his rifle to the ground and straightened, holding his empty palms up to show he meant no threat. The morning air bit at his fingers, but he kept them spread wide and steady. Behind him, he heard Nadali's soft footsteps. She moved past him with quiet dignity, her chin lifted high despite her injured arm. When she spoke, her voice rang clear in Apache, the words carrying across the snow-covered yard with unwavering strength. Though Weiss couldn't understand the language, he recognized the tone of truth-telling, and saw how some of the tension eased from the warrior's shoulders as she explained how he had found her and saved her life. The warrior's bowstrings relaxed slightly, but their arrows remained nocked. Louise understood their caution trust came dear on the frontier, and good intentions alone weren't enough to bridge the chasms carved by years of broken promises and betrayal. Chief Nanton dismounted, his moccasins making barely a whisper in the fresh snow. He spoke then, his voice deep and measured, while one of the warriors translated into rough English. The message was clear. This land, the snowfield stretching below them, and the creek that ran through the valley was disputed territory. Army had begun marking it with survey stakes, claiming it for settlement, but it had been Apache hunting ground for generations. By sheltering Nadali, Louise had unknowingly stepped into a quarrel that ran deeper than simple sanctuary. Louise nodded slowly, acknowledging the complexity of his position. Then he remembered something that might help. "If I may," he said, keeping his movements slow and obvious as he reached into his coat. He withdrew his small leather journal, the one where he'd recorded everything since finding Nadali. "Here," he offered, holding it out. "I write everything. The storm types. How I treated her wound. Even," he paused, meeting Nanton's gaze directly, "the fire I saw to the south that night. One fire, moving fast through the storm. The kind a man makes when he's running from something." One of the younger warriors translated Luce's words. Chief Nanton took the journal, turning its pages with careful fingers despite the morning cold. Though he might not read English, he studied the neat columns of times and temperatures, the carefully drawn map marking the ravine where Louise had found Nadali, the notes about wound care and fever breaking. A long moment passed as Nanton considered the evidence before him. The sun climbed higher, making the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds around them. Finally, the chief spoke at length to his warriors. A quiet council formed in the yard, voices kept low as they discussed Luce's fate. Nadali stood apart from both groups, her own people and the man who had saved her, watching the deliberations with dark, concerned eyes. When she caught Luce's glance, she gave him a small smile of encouragement. At last, Chief Nanton turned back to Louise. Through the translator, he delivered his decision. Louise would come to their winter camp under watch, to speak further about what he knew and what he had seen. The words were both invitation and command. There was no real choice being offered. Louise understood. In the chief's position, he would do the same. Trust had to be earned, especially when it came to the safety of one's people. As the warriors prepared a litter for Nadali, making sure she could travel in comfort despite her healing wound, she moved to Luce's side. Her small hand found his and squeezed briefly, a gesture of reassurance that spoke louder than words. When they helped her mount, she guided her horse to ride beside the litter, a clear statement of where she stood in this delicate balance of trust, and obligation. Luis took a few minutes to prepare for departure. He banked the fire carefully in the potbelly stove, making sure no stray spark could threaten his cabin. His rifle went over his shoulder. They hadn't asked him to surrender it, which he took as a hopeful sign. Finally, he locked the heavy wooden door. The keys weighed familiar in his pocket as he turned away from the only real home he'd known since leaving Missouri. Looking up at the winter sky, Luis couldn't be sure when or if he would return to this quiet sanctuary he'd carved out of the wilderness. But as he watched Nadali sitting tall and proud on her horse, saw the way she balanced between two worlds with such grace, he knew he was following the right path. The procession began moving down the snow-covered slope, warriors flanking Luis, as naturally as if they'd been riding together for years. The morning sun caught the frost crystals in the air, making them dance like tiny stars around the group as they descended into the valley, leaving the solitary cabin behind. Chief Nanton led the way, his straight back and steady guidance a reminder that this journey was just beginning. The disputed territory stretched out before them, its boundaries marked not just by survey stakes and patrol routes, but by the hopes and fears of all who called these mountains home. The hoofbeats that had begun the morning as a threat now fell into a steady rhythm, carrying them all toward whatever understanding waited at the winter camp. Luis found himself remembering the Apache phrase Nadali had taught him just the day before. She, do, you and I, together. As they rode through the crisp morning air, those words seemed to take on new meaning, expanding to embrace not just two people, but the possibility of two peoples finding common ground. The winter sun hung like a pale disk in the cloudless sky as the group made their slow progress through knee-deep snow. Luis's boots, though well-oiled, couldn't keep out the biting cold forever. He flexed his toes with each step his horse took, trying to keep the blood flowing. Around him, the Apache warriors moved with practiced efficiency, their horses picking careful paths through the drifts. Nadali rode in the improvised litter, wrapped in blankets against the chill. Though her fever had broken, the cold sapped strength from everyone. Luis kept a watchful eye on her, noting how she held herself straight despite obvious fatigue. Chief Nanton called their first halt near midday. Everyone dismounted, stamping feet and rubbing circulation back into frozen toes. Luis found a fallen log and knocked the snow from his boots, working feeling back into his feet with grimacing determination. He noticed the others doing the same, though with less obvious discomfort. Their moccasins, he noted, seemed better suited to this weather than his stiff leather boots. While they rested, Luis committed each landmark to memory, building a map in his mind for the journey back, whenever that might be. A massive granite boulder split down the middle like an axed log. A spruce tree bent almost double from years of wind and snow load. A place where water seeped from the rock face now, frozen into ghostly ice columns. The second stop came at a sheltered draw where the wind couldn't reach. Someone produced a blackened coffee pot, dented but serviceable. Soon the rich aroma of boiling coffee cut through the winter air. Luis accepted a tin cup with gratitude, wrapping his hands around its warmth. He watched as Nadali took small, careful bites of dried meat, her movements still showing the weakness of her recent ordeal throughout their journey. Chief Nanton remained apart from the main group. He rode slightly ahead and to one side, his attention constantly scanning the white horizon. Luis recognized the behavior of a leader carrying the weight of his people's safety. Every open space could hide a cavalry patrol. Every distant movement might signal threat. The sun was brushing the western peaks when they finally descended into the winter camp. Luis had seen Apache camps before, but never this close. Conical wickiups rose from the snow like small mountains themselves, their sides partially buried by carefully placed snow berms that helped block the wind. Thin streams of smoke rose from the tops, speaking of warmth within. Women moved between the structures carrying water and firewood. Children played in the packed snow, and older men sat in doorways, watching the returning party with sharp eyes. Young warrior Luis would later know as Taklishim approached, gesturing for Luis to dismount. He led Luis to a guest shelter on the edge of camp, close enough to be watched, far enough to show respect for privacy. Inside, a buffalo robe lay spread on a bed of fresh pine boughs, and a small fire of cedar wood already crackled in the center, sending up its sweet smoke dot. As Luis settled in, Nadali was led away to the women's circle. She glanced back once, giving him a small nod that somehow eased the tension in his shoulders. He knew she would be well cared for among her own people. Taklishim returned shortly with a wooden bowl of venison stew, the steam rising invitingly in the chill air. But before Luis could eat, the young warrior laid out the rules of his stay. His voice was clear and firm, though not unkind. "No walking in camp at night," Taklishim said, ticking off points on his fingers. "When elders present, no touching weapons. Speak only when asked." He paused, making sure Luis understood each point. Luis nodded solemnly. "Much obliged for the clarity," he said. Then, moving slowly and deliberately, he took his Colt revolver from its holster. With practiced motions, he unloaded it completely, making sure Taklishim could see every action. He placed the unloaded weapon in plain sight, beside his bedroll, then arranged himself to lie on his side, facing the door. It was a position that left him vulnerable, exactly the point. Among people who had every reason for suspicion, Luis wanted to demonstrate in the clearest possible way that he had not come to do harm. Taklishim's expression showed he understood the gesture. He nodded once, then left Luis to his meal. The stew was rich with meat and wild onions, warming him from the inside out. As Luis ate, he listened to the camp settling into its evening rhythm. Women called children in for supper. Men gathered in small groups, their low voices carrying snippets of conversation on the evening air. Somewhere, a baby cried and was quickly soothed. Night deepened like ink spreading through water. The first stars appeared, sharp and brilliant in the crystal-clear mountain sky. From somewhere in the camp came the soft, steady thrumming of drums, not the fierce rhythms of war or ceremony, but the gentle heartbeat of daily life. Luis lay back on his buffalo robe, the cedar smoke curling above him in lazy spirals. Almost without thinking, his lips began moving in a whispered psalm, one of the few he still remembered from happier days. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." The familiar words brought comfort, even here in this unfamiliar place. As his eyes grew heavy, Luis reflected on the strange paths that had led him to this moment. He had come to the high country seeking solitude, trying to escape the echoes of loss. Instead, he found himself drawn into something larger than his private grief, a chance, perhaps, to be of use in a world that sorely needed bridges between peoples. The drums continued their gentle rhythm, and the cedar smoke carried his thoughts upward into the winter night. His last conscious awareness was of the vast silence of the mountains all around them, holding the camp in its ancient embrace. Dawn crept over the Apache winter camp, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. Luis woke to the sounds of the camp coming to life, the crack of fresh kindling, the soft voices of women starting their day, the whicker of horses being fed. The cedar fire in his shelter had burned down to embers, and his breath made clouds in the crisp morning air. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside, careful to stay within the boundaries he'd been given. Women moved between the wickiups carrying water skins and firewood. Children darted through the paths, their moccasins hardly leaving prints in the packed snow. Every person, even the smallest, seemed to have a task. Luis felt the weight of idle hands, Among mountain folk, there was no shame greater than standing empty-handed while others worked. He caught Taklashim's eye and gestured to the general industry around them. "Might I be of help?" he asked. "I'm fair hand with leather and metal." Taklashim considered this, then nodded. He led Luis to a work area where damaged equipment waited for attention-cracked leather goods, dented cooking pots, and various items needing repair. An old stirrup leather lay split and useless beside a copper kettle with a broken bale. "You fix?" Taklashim asked, pointing to the items. Luis picked up the stirrup leather, examining the split. "Yes, I can mend this. Need rivets, though, and tools for the kettle bale." Taklashim disappeared into a nearby wickiup and returned with a small collection of tools and materials, evidence that the Apache were well-versed in maintaining their equipment. There were copper rivets, an awl, a small hammer, and various bits of wire and metal suitable for repairs. As Luis settled into work, two young boys drifted over to watch. They were perhaps 10 or 11 years old, their dark eyes bright with curiosity. Luis smiled at them and began explaining his work in simple terms, demonstrating each step. "See here," he said, holding up the split leather. "Gotta clean the braid first, make it straight." He trimmed the ragged edges with his knife, then used the awl to punch clean holes for the rivets. The boys leaned in closer, fascinated by the precise movements of his hands. "Now watch close," Luis continued, setting a rivet and carefully peening over the end with small taps of the hammer. "Too hard, you split the leather. Too soft, rivet works loose." He tested the repair, pulling hard on both sides. The mend held. Firm. The boys nodded in understanding. One of them picked up a rivet, turning it over in his small hands. Luis showed him how to feel the right spot for placement, then let him try hammering one himself. The boy's face broke into a proud grin. When the rivet held, next came the kettle. Luis studied the broken bale, the wire handle that allowed the pot to hang over a fire. He found a length of heavy wire in the tool collection and began shaping it to match the original. The boys watched as he formed neat loops at each end to attach to the kettle's ears. "More better than before," one boy said in halting English. When Luis tested the repair by lifting the kettle full of snow, Luis nodded. "Stronger now. Won't break so easy next time." As he worked, he became aware of an older woman watching from nearby. Her face was deeply lined, her hands gnarled but capable looking. This was an Goji woman with good hands, as he would later learn. She had been tending to Nadali's wound. She approached now, gesturing for Luis to follow her. He set aside his work and went with her to where Nadali sat wrapped in blankets near a fire. The older woman carefully unwrapped the bandage on Nadali's arm, examining Luis's stitching with professional interest. "Clean," she said in English, nodding approval. "Good medicine." She pointed to the neat row of stitches, then made a sewing motion with her hands before patting Luis's shoulder. It was clear she appreciated the care he'd taken with her patient. Nadali smiled at him, her color much improved from the day before. "She says you have healing hands," she translated. "Like her name, Good Hands." Luis ducked his head, embarrassed by the praise. "Just did what needed doing," he said quietly. The morning passed in steady work. Luis mended what he could, teaching the curious boys as he went. They proved to be quick learners, soon helping to hold items steady or fetch tools as needed. Their presence helped ease the tension that still hung over his status in the camp. As the sun reached its height, a runner came to summon Luis to council. Chief Nathan had called a meeting to address the matter of Dom Mateo and determine a course of action. Luis followed the runner to a large wickiup where several elders already sat in a circle around a small fire. Luis took the place indicated. For him, noting how the seating arranged everyone so they could see each other's faces clearly. Nadali sat across from him, her bearing straight and dignified despite her injury. Chief Nanton gestured for Luis to speak first. Drawing a deep breath, Luis told the story exactly as it had happened, finding the ravens, following their path to the snow-filled ravine, discovering Nadali half-buried and fevered. He described the drag marks from the trader's mule heading south and the distant fire he'd seen during the storm. "I know Don Mateo by reputation," he added carefully. "He runs credit like a trap, getting folks so deep in debt they can't see daylight. Then he takes what he wants, land, stock, even people claiming it's all legal by his books." When he finished, Nadali spoke. Her voice was firm, despite the difficulty of the subject. She described how Don Mateo had arranged a paper marriage with a corrupt subagent from the San Juan agency, trying to claim her through nothing more than a ledger entry and whiskey passed around. The council listened in stern silence. When she finished, heated argument broke out among the elders. Some called for immediate action to track down Don Mateo and kill him for his offense against their people. Others urged caution, pointing out that such violence would bring the army down on their winter camp. List then spoke again. "There's another way," he said carefully. "Come spring, when the roads open to San Juan agency, testimony and ledger pages can catch a man as surely as a rope. The agent there, the main agent, not the subagent, he's known to be honest. Show him proof of false papers and crook deals, he'll act on it." Chief Nanton considered this. "You are certain of this agent's honor?" "I've dealt with him," Luis nodded. "He follows the law, but he follows it true, not twisted like Don Mateo does. And he hates being made fool of by his own people." Discussion continued as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Luis could see the wisdom of the council at work. How they considered not just justice, but consequences. A wrong move could bring disaster on the whole tribe. Gradually, agreement began to form around Luis's suggestion. "We will wait for spring," Chief Nanton finally declared. "Gather evidence. Prepare our case. For now, we keep the peace for the people's sake." He looked at Luis with measuring eyes. "You will help with this?" "I will," Luis said simply. "What was done wasn't right. Helping make it right, that's just plain duty." As twilight settled over the camp, Luis returned to his shelter. The day's work had earned him, if not friendship, at least a measure of respect. He could feel the difference in how people looked at him now, less as an intruder, more as someone who might be useful to the community. Settling by his small fire, Luis took out his journal and knife. He carefully sharpened the blade, testing its edge against his thumb. Then, by the flickering firelight, he began to sketch the camp in his journal. The arrangement of the wickiups, the snow berms, the daily patterns of life he'd observed. He wanted to remember every detail, not just for possible testimony later, but because he sensed he was witnessing something precious, a people holding to their ways despite all pressures to abandon them. The fire popped and sparked as he drew, sending cedar smoke spiraling up through the smoke hole. Outside, the evening sounds of the camp drifted in, women calling children to supper, men talking in low voices, the distant neighing of horses. It was a peaceful sound, a sound of community, and Luis realized how long it had been since he'd felt part of any community at all. The evening fire cast dancing shadows across faces gathered in its warm circle. Sparks rose like fireflies into the darkening sky, while the snap and pop of burning wood punctuated the quiet conversations. Luis sat with his back against a log, noting how the flames painted everything in shades of amber and gold. Nadali settled nearby, wrapped in a thick blanket against the evening chill. Her eyes reflected the firelight as she gazed into the flames, gathering her thoughts. When she began to speak, her voice was soft but steady. "My mother was widowed 3 summers ago," she said, switching between Apache and English so all could understand. "The hunting had been poor that year. Don Mateo came often to our camp, offering credit for flour, coffee, sugar. She traced a pattern in the dirt with a stick. At first, it seemed like kindness, but the numbers in his book grew larger with each visit. Louise noticed how her fingers tightened around the stick as she continued. When winter came, he changed. Said mother owed too much. Said there was a way to settle the debt. Her voice hardened. He had already arranged it with the subagent at San Juan. Just needed to write in the ledger, pass some whiskey around. No priest, no ceremony, just papers saying I belong to him now. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. An elder woman spat into the flames, showing what she thought of such arrangements. The day I ran, Nadali continued, he had brought a mule team to take me south. When I refused to go, she touched her cheek briefly, remembering. His hand wore heavy rings. The sky that morning was hard as iron, promising snow. While he argued with mother, I slipped away. Ran until I couldn't feel my feet anymore. She looked at Louise then. You know the rest. The ravine, the storm. If you hadn't come, she left the thought unfinished. Louise sat quiet for a long moment, jaw tight with controlled anger at what she'd endured. Then, slowly, he began to speak of his own loss. My Sarah, he said, his voice rough with memory. She was everything bright in my world. We had a small farm in Missouri. Good land, good neighbors. He paused, gathering strength. The midwife said the baby was turned wrong. Sarah fought hard, but he shook his head. Lost them both before dawn. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. Couldn't bear the pity in men's eyes after. Their wives bringing food, speaking soft like, I might break. One day I just rode west. Kept riding till the mountains felt big enough to hold my grief. An older warrior across the fire made a scoffing sound. White man's God didn't help much, eh? Still you pray, like we heard in your shelter. Makes you soft. Louise turned to face him, speaking gently but firmly. Prayer ain't about being soft. Or hard. It's about staying steady. Helps a man's hand know true from false, right from wrong. Mercy took more courage than rage ever did. Nadali nodded slowly. Being alone has a price, she said. Each of us has paid it. Reckon so, Louise agreed. But maybe there's a time to stop paying it. Their words fell into thoughtful silence as the fire burned lower. Other conversations moved around them. Daily matters of camp life and tomorrow's needs. Louise noticed how the tension of earlier days had eased somewhat, as if sharing stories had built invisible bridges between worlds. The quiet was broken by approaching footsteps. Taklishim emerged from the shadows, carrying something wrapped in cloth. You fix things, he said to Louise. Maybe you fix this? He unwrapped a Springfield rifle, its stock marked with the careful notches of a hunter's count. Louise took the weapon respectfully, checking first that it wasn't loaded. His practiced hands found the problem quickly, a fouled chamber and a broken firing pin spring. May I? He asked, reaching for his tool roll. Taklishim nodded, settling down to watch. Louise worked methodically, cleaning the chamber with careful strokes, then fashioning a new spring from strong wire he carried for such repairs. Other men drifted closer, observing his skilled movements with interest. When he finished, Louise handed the rifle back to Taklishim. Try it now, he said. Action. Should be smooth. Taklishim worked the bolt several times, nodding with satisfaction at the clean click of metal on metal. Small nods of approval rippled through the watching men. Louise had proven himself useful in yet another way. As the fire burned down the coals, people began moving off to their shelters. Nadali lingered, her face serious in the dim light. Thank you, she said quietly, for not turning me away that day, for seeing me as a person, not a thing to be traded. From a pocket in her dress, she drew out a carefully braided strip of rawhide. I made this today. Among our people, such a gift. means friendship freely given, nothing more. Luis accepted the wristplate with proper gravity, understanding its significance. "I'm honored," he said simply, slipping it over his hand. Before seeking his own shelter, Luis took out his journal and wrote a single line by the light of the dying fire. "Mercy builds bridges where snow would swallow tracks." The words felt true, though he couldn't have said exactly why. The night settled deep and quiet over the camp. Guards moved silently at its edges, watching the darkness beyond. Inside his shelter, Luis listened to the familiar sounds of a sleeping community, the crackle of banked fires, the soft whicker of horses, the distant cry of a night bird. His hand found the rawhide plate on his wrist, and he thought about bridges built of small kindnesses, stronger than any hewn from timber or stone. The fire outside sank to gleaming coals, and still the guards walked their rounds, keeping watch while others slept. In the vast quiet of the winter night, something new had taken root. Trust, perhaps, or understanding. Whatever it was, it felt like the beginning of change. Dawn broke cold and clear on the first morning. Luis emerged from his shelter, breath frosting in the crisp air, and headed straight for the woodpile. He grabbed an axe, but paused when Taklashim approached with a friendly gesture. "I show you better way," Taklashim said, demonstrating how to split the pine logs along their natural grain. "Less work, more wood." Luis nodded gratefully, mimicking the technique. As they worked, sweat freezing on their foreheads, he pointed to the axe. "What your people call this?" "Tusbash," Taklashim replied, then grinned. "Now you teach me your word." "Axehead," Luis said carefully. They continued this way through the morning chores, trading words back and forth. By breakfast, Luis had learned stirrup was baike wadi, and ridge was jeel. The women watched with quiet approval as Luis constructed a simple wooden sled from spare planks and leather strips. He demonstrated how to secure water buckets on it, showing how one person could now easily drag several full containers across the packed snow instead of carrying them one by one. "This will save many steps," Estezan Doce acknowledged, testing the sled's smooth glide herself. Other women gathered to see, nodding at the practical improvement to their daily work. When Chief Nanton approached Luis that afternoon, his face was serious. "Tell me of the army patrols," he said without preamble. "When do they ride? How many?" Luis met his gaze steadily. "I see tracks sometimes, like any hunter would. 4 horses, maybe 6, crossing the lower valleys every few weeks. That's all I know, and all I'll say." Nantan studied him for a long moment, then gave a slight nod of approval. Luis had passed another test. He wouldn't betray either sides. Trust. The quiet routine of camp life continued through the second and third days. Luis learned more words, helped with repairs, and shared meals by the common fire. He noticed how Nadali watched him when she thought he wasn't looking, her eyes thoughtful. On the 4th day, trouble came. A thin boy of perhaps 10 years old, named Dastini, began shivering despite the midday sun. By evening, he burned with fever, his small face flushed and eyes bright. "Come quickly," Estezan Gochi called to Luis. She had seen him treat Nadali's wound and knew he had some healing knowledge. Luis found her in the boy's family shelter, already preparing willow bark. Together they worked through the night. Luis showed her how to layer heated stones wrapped in hides at the boy's feet, while she taught him the proper way to steep the willow bark for maximum strength. Hour after hour, they took turns bathing Dastini's forehead with cool cloths and helping him sip the bitter tea. The boy's mother sang softly, ancient healing songs that made Luis's throat tight with emotion. He thought of his own lost child and prayed silently as he worked. Near midnight, the fever finally broke. Dastini fell into normal sleep, his breathing easy and deep. Luis stayed until dawn, watching for any sign of the fever's return. the tribe noticed. Word spread quickly. The white man had kept vigil all night for one of their children. The fifth day dawned bright and cold. Luis was tired from his sleepless night, but joined the morning work as usual. By evening, Chief Nanton called a gathering at the main fire. "We have watched this man," Nanton began, his voice carrying to all assembled. "He works without complaint. He shares knowledge but keeps proper silence. He stayed with Dastini through the night." The chief's eyes met Luce's across the flames. "It is time to speak of spring." A murmur ran through the gathered people. Nanton held up his hands for silence. "When the snow melts and the road to San Juan Agency opens, we will take action against Don Mateo's false claim on my niece." He gestured to Nadali, who sat straight-backed and proud. "We will use the white man's own marks against him. Papers, ledgers, witnesses." Luis stepped forward. "I offer my cabin ledger as proof," he said clearly. "It shows the day and hour. I found Nadali, and this," he held up a small lead bullet, carefully wrapped in cloth. "This I took from her wound. It will match Don Mateo's pistol." Nanton nodded gravely. "These are good proofs. But we must seal this plan in the proper way." He turned to an elder, who brought forth a decorated belt of woven beads and leather. A peace belt, Luis realized, used to bind sacred agreements. "This belt will hold our words," Nanton explained. "When spring comes, we go together to the agency. We show their papers are false. We speak truth before their lawkeepers. No blood will be shed if justice can be found another way." Each person present touched the belt in turn, sealing their commitment to the plan. When it came to Luis, he placed his hand on the intricate beadwork with deep respect. "I'll stand with you," he said simply. "My word on it." Nadali was the last to touch the belt. Her fingers lingered on the patterns as she spoke. Don Mateo thought he could buy a woman's life with false papers and whiskey. He will learn that truth cannot be buried in snow. That night, as the fires burned low and people retired to their shelters, Luis sat a while under the stars. The past 5 days had changed something fundamental between himself and these people. Trust had been built slowly, tested and proven. True through shared work, shared vigils, shared words. He touched the rawhide bracelet Nadali had given him, thinking of the peace belt's promise. Spring would bring its own challenges, but for now, winter held them in this moment of understanding. The night was quiet, except for the soft crunch of snow under the guards' feet as they walked their rounds. Luis finally sought his shelter, knowing he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for, a place to belong, a cause worth serving, and people worth standing beside Dot in his shelter. He added a few lines to his journal by candlelight, recording the day's events and the peace belt ceremony. These pages too would bear witness when spring came. But that was a matter for another day. For now, the winter night wrapped the camp in stillness, and the future waited patient as the snow. A week passed in the Apache winter camp, each day marked by routine and growing familiarity. The weather had softened slightly, bringing a gentle thaw that made the snow settle and refreeze into a glassy crust. Luis had just finished his morning chores when excitement stirred through the camp. A runner had returned from the south, bringing news that made Chief Nanton's eyes narrow with interest. The runner, breathing hard from his journey, spoke rapidly in Apache. Luis caught fragments about a preacher and a mining camp, but waited patiently as Nanton absorbed the full report. Finally, the chief turned to address him. "There is a white holy man," Nanton said carefully, "who winters in the mining camp beyond the South Ridge. Reverend Josiah Pike. He says he will speak against Don Mateo when spring comes." Luis knew of Pike by reputation, a circuit preacher who rode the mining camps, known for fair dealings with both settlers and tribes. His word would carry weight at the agency, Luis said thoughtfully. A man of God's testimony is hard to dismiss. Nanton considered this, then made a decision. You and Taklashim will ride to the ridge above the mining camp. No further. Signal to them if you can. Learn what this preacher knows. Luis nodded, understanding both the opportunity and the limits of his trust. Much obliged. We'll leave. Within the hour, Taklashim appeared with 2 ponies already tacked. The young warrior grinned at Luis. Chief says you know mirror signals. Show me this magic. Luis patted his saddlebag where he'd stored a small signal mirror. Not magic, just sun and angles. I'll teach you on the ridge. They mounted carefully, mindful of the treacherous footing. The snow's crust could support a man's weight in places, but would shatter under a horse's hoof, potentially breaking a leg. They picked their way south at a walking pace, following game trails where possible. Ice under snow is like a snake, Taklashim observed, guiding his pony around a particularly glossy patch. Beautiful, but ready to strike. Luis agreed, keeping his mount to the rougher patches where their hooves could find purchase. The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystalline landscape, making it harder to read the snow's surface. They rode in companionable silence, both men alert for signs of danger or tracks. After 2 hours of careful travel, they reached the ridgeline overlooking the mining camp. Smoke rose from a scatter of log buildings and tents in the valley below. Luis dismounted, leading his pony into a sheltered spot among some pines. We'll signal from here, he said, pulling out the mirror. Watch how it works. Luis showed Taklashim how to catch the sun in the mirror's surface and direct the flash toward the target. The young warrior picked up the technique quickly, practicing, until he could hold the beam steady. Now we wait, Luis said, scanning the camp below through his rifle scope. If they're watching, they'll send someone up. They didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, a small figure in a heavy coat began trudging up the slope, following their mirror flashes. As the figure drew closer, they could see it was a boy of perhaps 12 years, red-faced from exertion and carrying a folded paper. Message. From Reverend Pike, the boy panted, handing the note to Luis. He stared curiously at Taklashim but showed no fear. Luis unfolded the paper and read aloud. Mr. Boone, I have evidence of Don Mateo's dealings that might interest you. We'll meet when the pass allows safe travel. God's grace go with you. Reverend J. Pike. He passed the boy a piece of jerky in thanks, and the child hurried back down the slope before the afternoon shadows lengthened. Luis tucked the note carefully into his journal for safekeeping. Good news? Taklashim asked. To be, Luis replied. Pike's willing to help. Now we just need spring to come. They mounted up for the return journey, taking a slightly different route to avoid their morning tracks. About halfway back to camp, Taklashim suddenly raised his hand in warning. Luis reined in, following the warrior's pointing finger to a splash of color against the white, a saddle blanket snagged on a low branch. They approached cautiously. The blanket was good quality Mexican weave, and when Luis turned it over, his jaw tightened. There, branded clearly in one corner, was Don Mateo's mark, a stylized M surrounded by a circle. He's been through here, Luis said grimly. Recently, too, or the snow would have buried it. Taklashim's face hardened. We should track him. No, Luis said firmly. We take this to Nen. Evidence is better than blood right now. The warrior nodded reluctantly, and they lashed the blanket behind Luis's saddle. The rest of the ride back to camp was tense, both men scanning the horizon for movement. The sun was setting by the time they rode into the camp's protective circle. Chief Nanton was waiting. Luis handed over the blanket without comment, watching as the chief's fingers traced the branded mark. The implications were clear. Don Mateo was operating in the district, perhaps planning something against the camp itself. We'll post more guards, Nanton said finally, and keep this as proof of his presence. Luis hung the signal mirror on his shelter's post, where it would catch the morning sun, ready for future use if needed. As darkness fell, soft flurries began, drifting down, but the wind remained gentle, more caress than bite. Inside his shelter, Luis sat cross-legged by his small cedar fire, using an awl to mend a worn spot on his moccasin toe. The simple task helped settle his mind after the day's developments. Pike's support was promising, but Don Mateo's proximity was troubling. The trader wouldn't have left his comfortable winter quarters without good reason. Still, they had a plan. Now, and all eyes gathering, Luis whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for these small mercies. The preacher's help, the found blanket, the kind wind, the fire's warmth. Tomorrow would bring its own concerns, but for tonight, the camp was safe. Under its blanket of new snow, and that was enough. He made a careful entry in his journal, recording the day's events, the found blanket, and Pike's note. Every detail might matter when spring came. Then he banked his fire for the night, the cedar wood glowing soft orange in the darkness. Outside, snow continued to fall in lazy spirals, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called once, twice, and was still. 2 days after finding Don Mateo's blanket, dawn broke over the camp with a mother's worried call. Luis woke to urgent voices. Outside his shelter, the sound carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. A child's harsh cough punctuated the quiet, rattling, and deep. He pulled on his boots and stepped out into the pale light. Across the camp, a small crowd had gathered around one of the family wickiups. Nadali stood at the entrance, her face drawn, with concern as she listened to the mother's rapid Apache. The sick child was Running Deer, a boy of perhaps 6 winters. He lay wrapped in blankets, his small chest heaving with each labored breath. His mother, Swift Stream, pressed a cool cloth to his forehead while speaking softly to him. Nadali caught Luis's eye and motioned him over. The cough started in the night, she explained in English. It grows worse with each hour. Luis knelt beside the boy, recognizing the wet sound in his chest. He'd heard similar during his trapping days, when winter dampness settled deep in the lungs. We need steam, he said, and something to ease the breathing. Nadali nodded. I know herbs that will help. Thyme from the trading post, mixed with wild honey. I can rig a steam tent, Luis offered. Need blankets and a steady kettle of hot water. They divided tasks quickly, each knowing time mattered. While Nadali went to gather her medicines, Luis collected what he needed. 4 long poles, several thick blankets, and a large iron kettle from the communal cooking area. He worked efficiently, lashing the poles into a frame that would hold the blankets above the sick child without crowding him. The kettle he set on a bed of hot coals just outside the frame, positioned so the steam would flow under the blanket walls. Nadali returned with a small clay pot of honey mixed with crushed thyme leaves. She knelt beside Swiftstream, showing her how to give small spoonfuls to the boy between coughing spells. The honey soothes, she explained to Luis as she worked. The thyme helps clear the chest. Luis nodded, remembering his wife using similar remedies. He pushed the memory aside, focusing instead on maintaining the fire under the kettle. As steam began to rise, he adjusted the blankets to create a tent that would hold the warm, moist air around Running Deer. The morning stretched into afternoon. They took turns rotating hot rocks from the fire into the kettle, keeping the steam constant. The rocks hissed as they hit the water, releasing clouds of vapor that filled the makeshift tent. Swiftstream remained by her son's side, singing soft songs and stroking his hair. Chief Nanton visited several times throughout the day, standing silent in the doorway. His face revealed nothing, but his presence spoke volumes about the tribes. Concerned for the child. By late afternoon, the boy's breathing began to ease. The harsh cough softened, becoming more productive. Swiftstream's tears fell freely when Running Deer managed to swallow broth without triggering a coughing fit. "Thank you," she whispered in Apache, gripping first Nadali's hand, then Luce's. "Thank you for helping my son." As evening approached, Luis stepped outside to gather more firewood. He found Chief Nen waiting, holding something in his weathered palm. Without speaking, the chief extended his hand, revealing a small shell amulet, pale and iridescent. Strung on a thin leather cord, Luis started to protest, but Nen shook his head once, firmly. This was not about conversion or faith. It was about recognizing a man who stayed steady when needed. Luis accepted the gift with a quiet nod, understanding its significance. Later, in his shelter, he carefully tucked the shell into his journal, alongside pressed leaves and other small treasures. From his years in the high country, the firelight caught the shell's surface, making it glow like captured moonlight. Night settled over the camp. The worst of the crisis had passed, though Luis knew they would need to maintain the steam tent through tomorrow to be sure. He walked to the communal fire for a late meal, finding Nadali already there. Staring into the flames, she looked up as he approached, her face troubled in the firelight. "May I speak with you?" "Of course." He sat nearby, giving her space but close enough to talk quietly. "I fear what is coming," she said after a long moment. "Not Don Mateo himself. I no longer fear his hand or his threats." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I fear the telling. When we go to the agency, I must speak of shameful things before strangers. Men who will look at me with cold eyes and write my words in their books." Luis felt anger rise at the thought of bureaucrats making her relive those moments, but he kept his voice gentle. "I will be there," he said, "standing right beside you. Not one word more than necessary will be spoken." She met his gaze, searching his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once, then returned to watching the fire. They sat in comfortable silence as the flames died down to coals. Above them, clouds were gathering again, but the air felt different now, less bitter, carrying a hint of change. Snow began falling as they retired to their shelters, but it was light snow, almost playful, lacking winter's usual sting. Luis lay awake for a while, listening to the soft hiss of snowflakes against the shelter walls. He thought about Nadali's courage in facing what lay ahead, about Running Deer's small hand gripping his mother's as they eased his breathing, about the shell amulet that represented something deeper than words could express. When morning came, the storm had passed. Luis stepped out into a transformed world. A clear blue dome arched overhead, so bright it almost hurt to look at. The creek that ran past camp had partially thawed in the night, and thin sheets of ice swirled on its surface like delicate glass leaves catching the sun. He watched the early light play across the ice fragments, thinking how nature had its own way of marking time's passage. Winter's grip was loosening, one crystal, one snowflake, one thaw at a time. Spring would come, bringing with it both challenge and hope. The camp stirred to life around him. Women emerged to rekindle cooking fires. Children ventured out to play. In the new snow and from Running Deer's wickiup came the sound of normal childhood chatter instead of coughing. Luis smiled, grabbed his water bucket, and headed toward the creek to begin another day. 2 weeks passed in the Apache winter camp like water flowing beneath ice, steady, purposeful, and quiet. Each day brought its own rhythm of work and rest. Building toward the coming journey, Luis settled into the routine, finding peace in the simple patterns of frontier life among these people who had chosen to trust him. Mornings found him at the communal fire, sharing coffee with the early risers, before tackling the day's tasks. His hands stayed busy mending gear, broken stirrups, torn blankets, loose knife handles. The work gave purpose to the waiting time, and the tribe's appreciation showed in small ways. An extra portion of stew, a newly tanned deerskin, quiet nods. Of respect, the boys of the camp became his constant shadows, especially during weapons maintenance. Luis took care to teach them properly, showing how to oil rifle stocks and clean chambers with patient attention to detail. Like this, he would demonstrate, running an oiled rag along the wood grain. Slow and steady. The wood drinks it in better that way. Young eyes watched intently as he explained how proper care meant better accuracy and longer life for their precious firearms. He taught them to listen for the subtle click of well-seated parts, to feel for rough spots that needed attention. Between these lessons, the women of the camp prepared tray bundle stacks of cured hides, bags of dried meat, intricate beadwork meant for future barter. Luis helped where he could, especially with the heavy lifting, earning grateful smiles from the older women whose backs weren't as strong as they once were. As March strengthened its grip on the land, the quality of light changed. Mornings dawned. Earlier and clearer, the sun's angle shifting to spring's promise. The scouts who patrolled the tribe's borders brought back increasingly hopeful reports. The valley road was breaking up, winter's hard pack giving way to mud and slush. Travel would soon be possible, if not yet easy. Chief Nanton called a council to choose the peace delegation. He selected carefully, himself, to carry the authority of the tribe. Nadali, whose testimony was central to their cause. Taklishim, young and strong, to serve as guard and messenger if needed. And Walking Cloud, an elder whose years lent weight to their words. Luis would complete their number, bringing his journal's evidence and his knowledge of white ways. "We travel light," Nanton announced, "but prepared for slow going. 15 miles a day through the thaw, if the weather holds." The night before departure, Luis rode to his cabin with 2 warriors as escorts. The familiar trail felt strange now, marked by weeks of absence. When they arrived, he found his home standing quiet and undisturbed, exactly as he had left it. Inside, Luis gathered what they would need: his leather-bound ledger with its careful notes, spare wool socks rolled tight, the small Bible his wife had given him, and several strips of jerky he had cached away. He swept the hearth clean and latched the shutters against spring storms, then took a last look around the single room that had sheltered him through so many solitary seasons. They rode back to camp by moonrise, the night clear and cold. Luis shared his last strips of bacon with his escorts, who accepted the offering with quiet thanks. The fatty warmth was welcome after the ride, and they sat in comfortable silence while their ponies dozed. Dawn broke pearl gray and still, painting the snow with subtle colors. The peace party gathered their gear efficiently, converting their winter sleds to travois better suited for the mixed ground they would encounter. Papoose bundles were secured, containing food, extra clothing, and the precious documents that would support their case. Nadali approached Luis as he checked his cinch one final time. "The road will be long," she said softly. He nodded, understanding she meant more than just a physical journey. "We'll face it together," he replied, using the Apache phrase she had taught him, "she-e-do." Her smile was quick but genuine. Before she turned to mount her own pony, they set out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, their small party strung out in single file through the patchy snow. The morning air held that peculiar mixture of winter's lingering chill and spring's warming promise. Their ponies' hooves broke through crusty snow into softer layers beneath, setting a steady but cautious pace. By midday, they had covered several miles of varying terrain. Nanton called a halt in a sheltered draw where their horses could rest and drink from a half-thawed stream. Luis unpacked his coffee pot and soon had a small fire going, the familiar aroma drawing the men closer. They shared pinole roasted, cornmeal mixed with a little sugar, passing a single cup between them. The simple food and hot coffee restored their energy for the afternoon's travel. Luis noticed how naturally they had fallen into sharing these small comforts. Barriers of culture softened by common purpose and trail courtesy. The afternoon sun cast long shadows by the time Nanton chose their camp spot near a thick belt of spruce. The trees would block the worst of any wind while providing dry wood for their fire. Everyone knew their tasks: securing horses, gathering firewood, setting up simple shelters, and worked with the efficiency of long practice. Once camp was established, Nanton assigned the night watches. Luis takes the second, he decided, knowing the mountain man was used to middle-night vigilance from his trapping days. They ate a simple supper of dried meat and corn cakes, talking little but sharing the comfortable silence of people at ease with one another. As darkness settled, those not on watch wrapped themselves in blankets near the banked fire. Luis's watch began at midnight. He sat with his back to a tree, rifle across his knees, listening to the night sounds of early spring. Water dripped steadily from thawing branches, marking time like a slow heartbeat. Occasionally, an owl called from the spruce grove, its voice carrying clear in the still air. He used the quiet hours to think about the journey ahead. The physical distance to the agency was considerable, but the real challenge lay in bridging the gap between two worlds. They carried justice in their saddlebags, Luis's journal, the bullet he had removed from Nadali's arm, testimonies carefully written and witnessed. But would it be enough? Would the agency men see past their prejudices to hear the truth? Looking at the sleeping forms of his companions, Luis felt the weight of their trust. These proud people had chosen a path of peace when war might have been easier. They'd accepted him, a white man, into their counsel and confidence. Whatever came at the journey's end, he would honor that trust. The moon tracked slowly across the sky, stars wheeling in their ancient patterns overhead. When his watch ended, Luis woke Taklashim with a gentle touch to the shoulder. The young warrior rose silently, checked his weapons, and took up his post while Luis found his own blankets. Sleep came easily, accompanied by the steady drip of thaw and the occasional hoot of an owl. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, the peace party rested safely under the vast frontier sky. Their first day's journey successfully completed. The third morning of their journey dawned cold and damp. Mist clung to the hollows, and their horses' breath came out in white puffs as they picked their way through patches of melting snow. Luis rode beside Nadali, their ponies matching stride as they followed the winding trail toward the creek ford. Ahead, the early spring air carried the sharp scent of wet alder and thawing earth. Water sounds grew louder as they approached the crossing. The gentle splash of the creek over rocks, the drip of moisture from branches. Everything seemed peaceful, ordinary. Then Luis noticed the silence. The morning birds had stopped singing. Before he could call out a warning, blue-coated soldiers emerged from the alder thickets, spreading out in a practiced formation. Their rifles gleamed dully in the morning light. At their flank rode a familiar figure, Don Mateo Salazar, his silver tooth catching the sun as he smiled. Captain Elijah Hart sat straight-backed on his army mount, every inch the proper officer. His voice carried clearly across the space between them. "Luis Boone, you are under arrest for aiding hostiles in abduction." The words fell like stones into still water. Luis felt rather than saw Nadali stiffen beside him. She started to move her horse forward, but Hart's sharp command stopped her. "Keep that woman back," he ordered his men. Two soldiers moved to block her path. Chief Nanton raised his palm, a silent command that held his warriors in check despite the fury in their eyes. The chief knew the terrible math of the situation. Any violence now would bring the full might of the army down on his people. They could not risk open battle. Luis kept his voice steady as he raised his hands, palms out. He turned slightly toward Nadali, meeting her gaze. "I'll answer with words where they use chains," he said quietly but firmly. The promise in his tone carried more weight than any shout could have. Two soldiers approached on foot, their boots squelching in the mud. One seized Luce's rifle, while the other bound his wrists with rawhide strips. They worked roughly, but not cruelly, following orders rather than seeking to hurt. Don Mateo urged his horse forward, triumph written across his features. He pulled a crumpled paper from his vest pocket, waving it like a flag. As for the woman, he announced with exaggerated courtesy, she is my lawful fiancée. I have here the proper documentation, complete with the subagent's seal. Luis watched the trader's performance with cold clarity. The man was a snake, but he knew how to work within the system's corruption. The ledger chit he brandished was worthless, a piece of paper bought with whiskey and false promises, but it would carry weight with those who wanted to believe it. Nadali sat very still on her pony, her face a mask of controlled emotion. Luis caught her eye again, holding her gaze steady. He would not flinch from this moment, would not show weakness. His look carried a silent vow. This was not the end of their story. The sun climbed higher as the soldiers prepared to march. They had 15 miles to cover to reach Fort Garland's stockade, and the spring mud would make it slow going. Captain Hart organized his men efficiently, placing Luis in the center of their formation. Move out, Hart ordered, and the column began to move south. Luis walked steadily between his guards, his boots finding purchase in the slick mud. He did not look back, but he knew Nanton would not on him. The Apache were masters of patient pursuit. They would follow, keeping to cover, marking their path so messages could be passed. The first day's march was grueling. Spring thaw had turned the trail treacherous, here a patch of lingering ice, there a boot-sucking mud hole. The soldiers cursed it under their breath as they slipped and struggled. Luis kept his balance better, used to mountain travel, but his bound hands made every stumble dangerous. They made camp that night in a grove of cottonwoods. The soldiers posted guards and built small fires, talking in low voices as they ate their rations. Luis sat apart, his back against a tree trunk, watching Don Mateo hold court among the officers. The trader's silver tooth flashed as he gestured, spinning tailies that painted himself as the injured party. Luis knew that somewhere in the darkness, the Apache were setting their own camp, carefully hidden but close enough to watch. As he dozed, fitfully, he imagined he could hear the soft click of stones being stacked into Can's trail markers that would help them maintain contact through the thick riverside willows. Dawn brought heavy dew and aching muscles. The second day's march proved even slower than the first. The trail descended into the river bottom, where springs seeped across their path, and last night's dew had turned the clay soil treacherous. More than once, horses nearly fell, and men cursed as they helped each other out of mud holes. Luce's wrists were raw from the rawhide, but he made no complaint. Each step carried him closer to Fort Garland, where he would finally have a chance to speak his piece. The truth was on his side, even if justice seemed far away at the moment. Don Mateo rode near him occasionally, unable to resist gloating. You should have minded your own business, mountain man, he said during one such pass. Some things are better left alone. Luis met his eyes steadily, but said nothing. Let the trader talk. Every word he spoke might later be used against him. Captain Hart maintained strict discipline despite the difficult conditions. He was a man caught between duty and conscience, Luis sensed. The captain followed his orders precisely, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with this mission. The second night, they camped on a small rise above the floodplain. The guards were more alert now, aware that they were being shadowed even if they couldn't spot their trackers. Luis caught occasional glimpses of movement in the willows, or thought he did. The Apache were masters of stealth, leaving signs only for those who knew where to look. He ate the hard bread and salt pork they gave him, conserving his strength. In the flickering firelight, he could see Don Mateo studying a creased map with Captain Hart, probably planning how to press his claim once they reached the fort. The trader's confidence suggested he had friends in high places, but corruption, like ice in spring, could crack under pressure. Luis settled back against his saddle, hands still bound, and watched the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there in the darkness, Nadali was watching too. He held on to that thought as he drifted into uneasy sleep. The guards changed watches through the night. From time to time, an owl called from the willows, or perhaps it wasn't an owl at all, but a signal passing between hidden watchers. The soldiers shifted nervously at such sounds, but Luis found comfort in them. They meant he wasn't alone. The night passed slowly, marked by the drip of dew from branches and the occasional stamp of a picketed horse. The spring air grew colder as darkness deepened, carrying the last bite of winter. Luis dozed upright, practiced at snatching rest in uncomfortable positions from his years in the mountains. Dawn would bring another day of slow march through mud, drawing them closer to Fort Garland and whatever justice or injustice awaited there. But Luis held on to his faith that truth would eventually come to light. He had seen too many seasons turn, too many storms pass, to believe that any man's scheming could forever hold back what was right in the last hours before dawn. He heard the soft rustle of willows that meant their hidden escorts were changing positions, maintaining their patient vigil. They would not lose each other in this maze of waterways and thickets. The path to justice might be muddy and slow, but they would walk it together, step by careful step. The journey to Fort Garland ended as the sun dipped behind the mountains. Luis's boots, caked with mud from the long march, scraped against the packed earth as the soldiers led him through the stockade gates. The fort's timber walls rose around him, rough-hewn logs stacked 15 feet high and topped with sharpened points. A tar paper office huddled against the western wall, its single window glowing with ALAMPLIGHT. Captain Hart dismounted, his boots striking the ground with authority. "Get him processed and settled for the night," he ordered 2 guards. "And remove those bindings." He showed no resistance. The rawhide strips fell away from Luis's wrists, leaving angry red marks where they had chafed during the march. He rubbed at the raw skin, grateful for even this small mercy. The guards took his elbow, guiding him toward a row of log cells built against the stockade wall. "In here," one guard said, swinging open a heavy door. The cell was small, but solid log walls chinked with mud, a dirt floor scattered with clean straw, and a narrow window cut high in the wall. A tin cup sat on a rough shelf, catching what remained of the evening light. Luis stepped inside, ducking his head beneath the low doorframe. The door closed behind him with a solid thunk, followed by the scrape of an iron bar dropping into place. He stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the DIMNESS. Captain Hart appeared at the cell door, his shadow falling across the straw. "The agency clerk is riding down from Del Norte," he said, his tone professional but not unkind. "There'll be a proper hearing once he arrives. Until then, you'll stay here." Luis nodded, understanding the captain's position. Hart was a man bound by regulations and chain of command, seeing the world through the lens of order and authority. There was no point arguing with him now. Once alone, Luis sank down onto the straw, his muscles aching from the long march. The cell silence pressed in around him, broken only by the distant sound of boots on wooden walkways and the occasional call of a sentry. He leaned his head back against the rough logs and closed his eyes. "Lord," he whispered, bitterness seeping into his voice, "this wasn't the justice I had in mind." The prayer felt harsh in his throat, almost like an accusation. But as he sat there in the growing darkness, other words came to him, fragments of scripture his wife used to read aloud on Sunday mornings. "Let justice roll down like waters," he murmured, remembering the verse, "and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." The familiar words settled something in his spirit. He had seen mountain streams break through ice in spring patient. Persistent, unstoppable. Perhaps justice worked the same way. The night deepened. Someone lit a lantern in the guardroom, its light spilling faintly through his window. Louise arranged the straw into a crude bed and tried to find a comfortable position. The cell was cold, but no worse than many places he'd slept during his years in the mountains. Morning brought watery sunlight and the smell of wood smoke from the fort's cook fires. A guard pushed a tin plate through the door. Slot beans, hardtack, and coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in. Louise ate slowly, saving half the hardtack for later. Around noon, the door creaked open. A guard with raw, chapped hands stepped in, carrying a folded cloth. "Brought you a biscuit," he said quietly. "Fresh from the cook's wife." He paused, eyeing Luce's belt knife, which lay confiscated on the guardroom desk. "That's good steel. You carry. Could use some help getting a proper edge on mine, if you're willing to teach." Louise studied the man's face, young, earnest, not unkind. "Pull up that bucket," he said, gesturing to an overturned pail. "I'll tell you about stones and angles." For the next hour, Louise demonstrated proper knife-sharpening technique using gestures and clear instruction. The guard listened intently, asking good questions about pressure and stroke direction. It was a small thing, this exchange of knowledge for kindness, but it helped ease the weight of confinement. Miles away, in a rented room above Hanson's livery, Nadali sat straight-backed in a wooden chair, her eyes fixed on the man before her. Reverend Josiah Pike had arrived by wagon as soon as the road allowed, his black coat dusty from travel. Now he stood at the room's small window, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "There's something you should know," Pike said, his voice heavy with memory. "Before I took up the cloth, I served as a scout in the Indian Wars, helped the army track raiding parties, led them to winter camps." He turned to face her, his eyes shadowed. "I've carried that shame for 20 years. Nadali watched him steadily, reading the truth of his confession in the slump of his shoulders and the tremor in his voice. "That's why I'm here now," Pike continued. "Can't undo what's done, but I can stand as a witness for peace. Tell the hearing what I know about corrupt Indian agents and men like Don Mateo who profit from their schemes." His words hung in the air. Between them, waited with both regret and determination. Nadali nodded slowly, understanding that this man's testimony, shaped by his past sins and present redemption, could carry special weight with the authorities. Meanwhile, Chief Nanton had gathered his small council in a hidden camp along the creek. They spoke in low voices, planning their next moves with the patience of hunters. Taklashim sat cross-legged near the fire, his young face serious as he received his instructions. 2 days to reach the agency, Nanton said, drawing a rough map. In the dirt, 2 more to return. The clerk who helped us before will have duplicate pages from the sub-agent's ledger proof of the false arrangement with Don Mateo. Taklashim nodded, memorizing the route. He would travel light and fast, using hidden trails to avoid the main roads where soldiers patrolled. The documents he would bring back could expose the corruption at the heart of their troubles. Back in the stockade, evening settled over the fort like a heavy blanket. Luis lay on his straw pallet, listening to the changing of the guard and the ordinary sounds of military life. From the guardroom came the soft notes of a harmonica someone, playing an old trail song about home and distance. Boot heels scraped against the plank floor as soldiers moved about their duties. The sound reminded Louise of his own boots, still muddy from the march, sitting in the corner of his cell. He reached down and brushed off some of the dried clay, remembering the long walk that had brought him here. Through his window, he could see stars appearing in the darkening sky. The same stars would be shining over Nadali, over Taklashim on his mission, over all those working to bring truth to light. He whispered another prayer, no longer bitter but filled with quiet trust in justice's slow, but certain path. The harmonica player in the guardroom switched to a hymn, Amazing Grace, its familiar notes drifting through the evening air. Luis closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. Even here, locked behind log walls, Grace found ways to seep through the cracks. A guard's boots clumped past his door, pausing briefly before moving on. The fort was settling into its nighttime. Routine lanterns being lit, reports being filed, soldiers preparing for another cold night on the high frontier. Luis pulled his blanket closer, grateful at least for the shelter of walls against the spring wind in his mind. He could see Taklashim moving through the darkness, following secret paths toward the agency and its hidden evidence. He thought of Reverend Pike, bent under the weight of old guilt but standing up now for what was right. And he pictured Nadali, her strength and dignity unbroken by all she had endured. The harmonica's last notes faded into silence. Luis shifted on his straw bed, finding a position that eased his tired muscles. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now he could rest, trusting in the slow work of justice and the faithfulness of friends, who moved like water through the night. The afternoon sun slanted through pine boughs when Taklashim rode into the hidden camp, his pony's flanks dark with sweat. From his saddlebag, he drew out folded papers, the subagent's ledger copies, each bearing clear initials and dates that revealed Don Mateo's scheme for what it was. A debt trap, not a marriage promise. In his boarding house room, Reverend Pike's. Pen scratched steadily across paper, documenting every threat Don Mateo had made in the mining camp. His hands trembled slightly, but his words stood firm and clear. Nearby, Natalie sat with Pike, practicing her testimony. She chose simple, dignified words that would leave no doubt about the truth. "I will speak plain," she said, "so none can twist my meaning." Captain Hart posted the hearing notice by late afternoon dawn tomorrow in the stockade yard. The agency clerk, Horace Bell, would attend as witness. Though bound by military orders, Hart's jaw tightened as he read Don Mateo's claims. At sunset, Luis stood at his cell window while Nadali approached the bars, a guard watching from the shadows. She passed him the shell amulet through the iron gap. "Tomorrow it belongs on your neck, not mine," Luis said softly, pressing it back into her palm. As darkness fell, Chief Nen positioned his warriors around the town's edges close enough to be seen, far enough to avoid conflict. Their weapons remained peaceful. Bowstrings loose, lance tips covered. In his cell, Luis lay facing the door, drifting into dreams of his cabin's warm lamplight. The morning sun crept over the stockade walls, painting the yard in weak light. Townsfolk gathered, shuffling their boots in the mud, while soldiers stood at attention. Agency clerk Horace Bell settled onto a wooden chair, ledger in hand, as Captain Hart took his place atop a sturdy crate that served as judge's bench. Don Mateo swaggered forward, silver tooth catching the light as he produced a wrinkled paper. "Chit," with a flourish. Bell leaned forward, comparing it with the copies Taklashim had brought. His weathered face creased into a deep frown as he traced the lines with his finger. "This subagent exceeded his authority," he declared. "No priest present, no witnesses listed. And here," he tapped the page sharply, "goods marked as bride. Price against debt. That's not legal marriage. That's trafficking." Reverend Pike rose slowly, his voice quavering with emotion. "I once scouted against the Apache people," he confessed, head bowed. "That shame weighs heavy. I cannot stay silent now while a woman is traded like cattle on paper." Nadali stood last, her spine straight as a lodgepole pine. Her clear voice carried across the yard as she recounted Don Mateo's strike, her desperate flight through winter storms, and Luce's merciful rescue. From her pouch, she drew the bullet Luis had saved, holding it up for all to see. Captain Hart's eyes moved deliberately from the evidence to Chief Nanton's distant figure beyond the fence. Drawing himself up, he pronounced his ruling. Don Mateo's claim was void. Luis would be released, and the tribe's traditional hunting rights in the disputed draw would stand until territorial courts could properly settle the matter. Don Mateo's face twisted with rage. He lunged forward with a curse, but soldiers caught his arms, wrestling him back as others moved to confiscate his ledgers for investigation. As Luis stepped out of the stockade, his breath caught in his throat. He watched Nadali's shoulders relax, tension flowing away like spring melt. The afternoon sun blazed in a wind-scrubbed sky as Luis stepped out of the stockade. Nadali and Chief Nanton waited quietly, their horses' reins loose in their hands. Without hurry or fanfare, they mounted and pointed their mounts northward, respecting the tired horses on the muddy road home. Near sundown, the familiar shape of Luis's cabin emerged against the darkening sky. He dismounted, his boots squishing in the spring muck, and unbarred the door. Though the hearth lay cold, it stood ready for new life. Chief Nanton crossed the threshold first, carrying a bundle of dried mesquite wood for the stove, a peace offering that spoke louder than words. His gentle warning followed. The tribe's crossing places must be respected, and the women's right to choose their own path held sacred. Luis measured coffee into his tin pot and promised softly, "No person will ever be traded at this table." As stars began piercing the darkness, Reverend Pike's wagon creaked to a stop outside. The preacher's blessing was simple, speaking of mercy's power and courage's worth. Nanton nodded, granting permission for Nadali to stay through spring, with the understanding that visits would be frequent and all decisions made in honest daylight. When evening settled fully, Luis trimmed his lamp's wick and set the light in. His window. The small flame gleamed across the snowfield like a trusted beacon, promising shelter to all who journeyed through the dark dot. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.